This is an oral history interview conducted for the Witness to War Serving a Nation project at Nauset Regional High School on Cape Cod, Massachusetts. For the sake of this interview, please state your full name and community in which you now reside.
My name is Mike Mountain, and I live right here in Brewster.
Okay. So, how did you first end up on Cape Cod?
After college, we came here, my wife and I, more or less for a vacation, never left. We stayed for a couple of weeks. It was the summertime. We stayed for a couple of weeks in Nickerson, camping. We had friends who were in Howich, and so we ended up spending the whole summer kind of hanging out with them. And then when winter came, the house that they were staying in, we rented for a winter rental for the winter, and we actually ended up never leaving. Liked it here.
That's interesting. So you never came during your childhood, it was just during
No, I don't think I did.
Oh.
I don't think I ever came here in the
Okay.
summer.
How did your family react to your decision to enlist in the military? Or were you drafted into the military?
I enlisted, but it was somewhat under duress. The year was 1968. I had graduated high school in '66 and had gone to college for like a semester and a half. I was never a very good student, and I just wasn't that interested, I guess. So when I dropped out, I found that, there's a very good chance that I could be drafted. So I found out that if I enlisted, there was a pretty good chance that I, would be sent somewhere other than Vietnam. So
Okay.
that was my whole reason for talking to the recruiter. And in fact, he told me, well, if you enlist, first of all, I had to take a battery of tests. I always did well on tests. So he said, you can go into intelligence. So, you'll probably end up going to Germany or Fort Devens, which is right here in, western Massachusetts,
Yeah.
or used to be. And I said, okay. So for me, it was a pretty good trade-off. It was, I didn't know the first thing about Vietnam, and I didn't really want to know about it, I guess.
Yeah.
So I did enlist, and, shortly I went to basic training, and I think, that wasn't too bad. It was harsh, but I was in very good shape, and I could do 200 sit-ups, can't do that anymore.
Wow.
And like 60 push-ups, so I was in very good shape, and I kind of appreciated that. Then I guess I got, you get a 30-day leave, so I went back to Worcester, where I had grown up, and then I was sent to Fort Holabird in Maryland, which is the smallest military base in the country, and it's really like a college campus. It's about like the size of a small college. And I did like 2 months of intelligence training there, and then I got orders, of course, to Vietnam. This was the height of the Vietnam War in 1968. Shortly after I got there, they started tapering the numbers down. I think they realized it was time to leave.
So what was your reaction when you found out that you had to go to Vietnam to serve in the war?
My reaction was, when you're a kid, I was like 20, and your parents tell you, mow the lawn or take out the garbage. It was just, I didn't know anything about Vietnam. No, there was no big, where I was from anyway, there wasn't a big, there weren't demonstrations that, so I kind of thought, well, I guess I took the military and the government sort of at face value and said, gave them the benefit of the doubt. After getting to Vietnam, it was like I was shocked, how, first of all, I could see very quickly, within weeks of my assignment, that there was no way that we were going to win this war, and that we probably shouldn't ever have been there, in the first place. I was assigned to, I didn't really, when they sent me over there, you go to San Francisco and they fly you to Japan, then you go to a place called Long Bin, stayed there for a few days. Then I spent about a week at the United States Embassy in what used to be Saigon. Spent about a week there waiting for an assignment. From there, it was like going back in time. I went to Nha Trang, I guess by airplane. Then you get on a helicopter and there's another short leg, and then there's one more. And when I got off the last shuttle, the last helicopter, I was in Kontum, which is in the Central Highlands, where most of the people are indigenous people. Oh. In the town there were Vietnamese, but most of the villagers were Mountain Yard people, indigenous people.
Okay.
And it was, that would have been like in September 1968, and the Tet Offensive occurred like in the previous January. And this area where I was had been overrun actually by the North Vietnamese. And they had actually held on to it. And it was a province, that's where the province headquarters was. It was the seat of government. They had a military government. The province was run by a Vietnamese colonel.
Oh, okay.
And my job, I was assigned to the S2, which is intelligence. And I had an officer who was my boss, who was a captain at the time. He shortly was reassigned. There was another captain for a very short period. He was reassigned. And for quite a long while, probably 4 or 5 months, I had no officer. I more or less ran the operation of the S2. It was a section of the MACV, Military Assistance Command Vietnam Advisory Team 41. And we were advisors to the provincial government, which would have been like a state in this country, province, except that it was run by a colonel. And my senior commander was a colonel, and he was the province senior advisor.
Oh, okay. So how would you have described a typical day where you were serving?
Typical day, my job was to keep track of the movements of the North Vietnamese. We were in a place where the North Vietnamese were coming from Cambodia and Laos. Kontum was up sort of near the tri-border area, and so they didn't have a huge presence in our province. A lot of it was local force, VC kind of activity, hit and run kind of thing. But every now and then they would, the main force, North Vietnamese units would come through, and they'd stay and they'd stage assaults here and there. Most of the attacks that I saw where at the compound that I was on were indirect fire attacks, mostly mortar and 122 millimeter rocket coming down out of the surrounding hills. You know, it's very mountainous area. And typical day for me would be processing reports and incident reports and interviews that would come in from really all over the province, from different units, from the Vietnamese, from American units that operated in the area. And you take all this information and try to make sense out of it and find out what were the intentions, the North Vietnamese, and what basically what to expect, them, and what their capabilities would have been, and what so that there would be, some sort of defense. I saw my job as a defensive kind of thing, like warning units of the presence of these large units moving through their area and so forth.
Oh, that's okay. What was it like living so far from home?
I was pretty busy most of the time, and I didn't, that didn't bother me too much. I think I had kind of gotten used to it because I had been in basic training.
Yeah.
I was kind of homesick when I went to basic training, but then after a while you get used to it. It's like anything else, I guess.
Like going to college, yeah.
Like going to college. It was, and I'll tell you, it was an education for me too.
Mm-hmm.
The other responsibility we had, as a team, there were probably 20 or so members of my team, and there was another American advisory team that worked with the Vietnamese infantry units in the area, advising them. It was more tactical. We were more like civil. And I found out, I could see how much corruption there was right away in the government. And I had a counterpart, a young Vietnamese lieutenant who I said to him one day, does it bother you that you go out with your guys and, you get injured or your guys get injured and your boss is like so corrupt, he's taking, making money, kind of profiting off of the war. When the United States goes into a country like Vietnam, or I'm sure anywhere, it's like the Roman Legion, and they bring a lot of stuff, and all this stuff ends up on the black market. And this guy was kind of cashing in on it, like food, medicine, and because it was up to him to distribute it. So an example would be, he's supposed to distribute rice. And what he should have done is done it on different days of the month in different areas, but he would just show up with all this rice in one place unannounced, and of course nobody was there. There weren't many people there to take it, and then the rest of it would end up, he'd sell it. That was just one example. So I said to my counterpart one time, does that bother you? And he said, well, the Vietnamese people are probably, look at it differently. And he said most Vietnamese would think he was a fool if he didn't take advantage. And I think that was the day I really understood that this war, we weren't going to win this war. We were backing the wrong horse. It was like we should have been, early on, back in the 50s, we should have been supporting the, the nationalists, people who ended up fighting.
Yeah. As a child, what was your understanding of war?
Oh, we used to go to a lot of cowboy movies when I was young, and we go to war movies, and it was, exciting. We used to play war games. I grew up in a place that was pretty, a lot of it was wooded, kind of on the outskirts of Worcester. And, I had a great childhood. We played basketball, we played football when we were really young, and there was a big gang of kids in the neighborhood, and we all, would play guns, and it was great fun,
Yeah.
But
What were you?
the real thing isn't so much fun
Yeah.
at all.
Yeah, compared to what,
No.
when you were
You grew up
a
with.
kid, and then when you were in the actual.
Yeah, it was kind of a rude awakening. I think that was part of the myth, like, oh, this is, in a way, I would have liked to avoid it. I knew that going in, but I didn't, I thought in a way, this is going to be interesting, and I was, wanting to do my part. I certainly wouldn't want someone to have to go in my place,
Mm-hmm.
Kind of had that attitude, I guess, but it quickly
Yeah.
changed. My attitude about the war was completely different.
Yeah. What did you do in your free time, or were you able to have free time while you were serving?
At one time, one of my jobs was to get into a really small airplane with a pilot. It was like a two-seater, and do visual observation. So we'd fly around and we'd look for bunkers and trails and so forth. But it
Wow.
was really hard you wouldn't see much. And in fact, the only time we knew there was North Vietnamese or VC in a particular area as we were flying around was if they would shoot at us. That's the only way you could tell. It was like, so one of the things I did was they sent me for about a week to Nha Trang, and I took a photography course. So they showed me how to develop the film and take pictures. So I was supposed to be taking pictures of bunkers or trails or evidence, of enemy activity, but there was really not a lot to be seen, from the air. So I would go out a lot of times to the surrounding villages and take this camera, and I would take pictures of the people, the Montagnard people.
Wow.
And I tried to, kind of establish a kind of rapport with the people, because I felt like that was part of my job, to,
Wow.
to kind of protect these people, who are out there.
Wow. What kind of friendships did you develop in the military?
Just I would say just very close within the team. There were a couple of radio operators. There was a clerk that worked in our section. I would spend all day writing an intelligence summary from all the information that would come in. I would kind of summarize it, and he would type it up. We had a mimeograph machine. You probably don't remember those,
No.
but it was like a little printer machine. It had actual ink, and would run off these copies, and we'd go around and hand deliver them, and it was all confidential or secret
Yeah.
summaries. And then I think we had another one that I wrote, and it was like every week. I don't know what we call that one. And then I would have to brief other people from the team, and then people coming through from other units. Every Sunday I gave a briefing mostly to officers. I was an enlisted man, but I had to brief all these. Sometimes, generals would come through from time to time. The odd thing is when somebody really important, like high up in the chain of command was coming through, they didn't want me to talk to them because I think I was too honest. I would tell them
Wow.
what was really happening on the ground, and so I would end up telling my boss, the colonel, and then he said, you brief me, and then I'll brief these, General Abrams or
Yeah.
whoever was coming through.
What's the first thing you think of when you hear the word Vietnam?
Just waste.
Mm-hmm.
Waste of time, waste of life,
Materials.
waste.
Materials, yeah.
Material, yeah, everything. And also deceit. I think it was a kind of a long-running deceit. Anybody who's read the Pentagon Papers, they were published like in 1971, I think, which was pretty late in the war. And you could see back to the mid-60s, the people who were the architects of the war, they understood that it wasn't going to work, and they kept telling the American people that there was, we were making progress and that we were going to defeat the communists. We never had a chance of ever defeating the communists in Vietnam. There was never any hope of that, and they kept that hope alive, I think, in the American people, which kept it going on way longer than it should have gone on.
Wow. What would you say was the hardest decision you had to make while serving?
I don't know. Oh, one day, the radio operator came into where I was working. We worked in bunkers on the grounds of the province headquarters, and these bunkers were sort of half on the ground and then kind of surrounded by sandbags, so they were like fortified.
Yeah.
Probably a room the size of this. So you might think of a construction trailer, like half buried in the ground.
Oh, yeah.
With sandbags all around and up top, and so we worked in an area like that. So there was intelligence, S2 at one side, and operations at the other side of the trailer, and in the middle was a radio, radio operator. And we also had other communications, like teletype sort of machines. So there was information always coming in that you had to process. And so the radio operator, I was there just by myself working, and the radio operator came in to the section, and he said, the Vietnamese have somebody over there in the bunker down the way. It was like 30 meters away from where I was.
Wow.
And it looks like they're getting ready to torture him. And I said, that was kind of surprising to hear. I wasn't under any illusions. I knew that torture went on and everybody did it. But I guess I wasn't ready to accept it.
Yeah.
I never, first of all, I never thought it was worth, it didn't work, it didn't produce good information, and it was against the Geneva Conventions. It was illegal. And so I went over there, and here was this old man they had tied to a chair. This was down in the ground, like in a bunker. When I got down there, they had him tied to a chair, and this Vietnamese lieutenant had this big knife, like a big knife, and there were 2 or 3 enlisted Vietnamese soldiers there, and I didn't have an interpreter with me, so I couldn't communicate with them, but I let them know that, this wasn't going to happen,
That's good.
So,
that's good.
I kind of gestured for this knife that he had, I was getting ready to work on this old man with, and he, amazingly enough, he gave me the knife.
Really?
So
Wow.
I cut they had him tied with wire, like commo wire, to this chair. So I kind of cut him free. And as I was standing him up to take him out of the bunker, this officer put his hand on my shoulder. So I turned around and I gave him a shove.
Oh my God.
And he kind of bounced off the wall. And as I was going out, I had this old man kind of in front of me, and I could hear his guys like chambering rounds into their M16s, really distinctive sound. And I can remember thinking for an instant, oh, this is where the front of your head is going to explode now. As I was going out this doorway.
Wow.
So I shuffled them over to my side. I knew they wouldn't go over there, they weren't really allowed into that area. So I took this man, it's just an old man, he looked like he could have been some village elder, like a Montagnard,
Yeah.
or something like that. And I don't know how he ended up with them, but in any case, he looked a little bewildered. So there was money there in our office that was there. I think it was from the CIA or something, and it was for paid informants. So I took some money and I kind of shoveled them out. I had a Jeep, put them in the Jeep, and drove them out of town to like the closest Montagnard village, closest place to us. I gave him this money, and we party company. I wished him luck.
Wow.
And so I thought that would have been like the end of it, but then I got kind of called into the colonel's office, and he says, "What's this about? You're assaulting a Vietnamese officer." And I said, "Well, I pushed him, but it wasn't until he put his hand on me."
Yeah.
And
right.
I said, this is the United States signed the Geneva Conventions, and this is a violation. What he was starting to do was in violation of that, and then I said, well, I guess there had been a bit of a dust-up about it, a little brouhaha, and it probably went up the chain of command, and the Vietnamese might have been upset. The whole time, this officer, when I was trying to get this guy free, was like smiling, because they don't like, it's kind of a cultural thing, they don't like confrontation.
Yeah.
So I told my colonel, I said, if he didn't want a confrontation, well, maybe he shouldn't have been trying to torture old men, And if he didn't want to get shoved, maybe he shouldn't have put his hand on my shoulder.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're right.
So I didn't really know why I did that. It was like I kind of run out of patience, I think, with it. And I think you hear about a lot of soldiers who come back from some of the wars we're involved in now, and they're damaged. Physically they're okay, but their spirit is seriously damaged. I didn't want that for me. You have to be careful, not just of getting wounded. You have to be careful how your behavior is going to be, because you have to live with that, And then I've seen, lots of cases of people whose spirits are wounded, and you don't see these wounds, but And it's not just stuff like that, but it's things that you see, things that you're just aware of on a day-to-day basis, you know.
Yeah.
Just the humanity of war, you know, it changes people. You have to be careful of that, as well as, you know, just being wounded, losing an arm or a leg, it's the same thing. You know, if you go home and you're breathing and you have all your arms and legs, it's not going to do any good if you have no soul.
You're right. Yeah.
So I didn't know that. I didn't tell him that, you know. But as I thought back on it, that's probably, I did it more for myself, I think, you know. So that kind of caused kind of a brouhaha. There was a couple other situations where I got into kind of separated from my unit, and you know, I kind of got into tight situations with North Vietnamese running all over the place, and I wasn't quite sure I was going to make it out of there a lot of times. But most of the day-to-day stuff was was nothing like that, you know, not so much adrenaline.
What was the happiest memory that you remember from your time serving in Vietnam?
Going home, I guess.
Going home?
Getting on that plane. So when I came home, I had another year and a half because I enlisted. I only had a year in Vietnam, so it was like, that was pretty much made up. The training and my tour in Vietnam was like a year and a half. So a total of 3 years. So I had another year and a half of active duty. So I was assigned to the Continental Army Intelligence Command, which is at Fort Bragg, which is the biggest military base in the world. It takes up a good part of North Carolina. And I was an analyst for Southern Africa. So as I was doing that, all of a sudden, you know, and I studied Africa, I wrote what were called products, monthly products that you'd have to update about the military of South Africa, the you know, lines of communication, the economy, and a lot of background in detail about South Africa. And all of a sudden I'm getting documents coming in. There were documents coming in from all other branches, all the other intelligence agency. You know, I was a military intelligence, but there was a central intelligence, there was State Department had an intelligence branch, and the Defense Intelligence Agency. Today there are like 17 different ones, and they're all kind of duplicating what I was doing. So, but then it changed, and I started getting stuff about the Middle East. And I was kind of curious about it. You know, I would go look at satellite photos of airfields in the Middle East, you know, in Saudi Arabia. And I didn't really understand, you know. Finally, I asked a friend of mine who was in planning, you know, kind of like strategic planning at Fort Bragg, and he was an officer, and he said, well, you're probably on a contingency list to go to the Middle East. And that was a time when, this was 1970 or so, and that was a time when people were nervous about the oil, you know, and OPEC, whether the oil was going to be available. And I think they were making plans, kind of just contingency plans to, you know, if we weren't, oil is a very important thing. So, strategic. So if, you know, the OPEC had said, okay, you know, we're going to withhold oil, I think the United States would have gone in and taken it. And it would have been Saudi Arabia. As it turned out, it was Iraq. And the first war with Iraq, Desert shield, I think it was called, was kind of went off like clockwork, and it's because they'd been planning it for 30 years.
Yeah.
They'd been practicing out in the desert, in California, so they had it kind of fine-tuned. And so when I found out I might be on this contingency list, be sent to war again, I decided to apply for a conscientious objector status, which means, well, you can be in the military, but they but it never really got very far. I couldn't fulfill all of the requirements, I guess.
Yeah.
But if I had been sent, I would have refused to go. And there are people who told me, well, if you don't go, if they send you, you don't go, you go to jail. And I said, well, that's okay.
If you don't mind me asking, what was your darkest memory from your time serving in Vietnam?
It was sort of the overall feeling that this war should have ended a long time ago. And, this was 1968. It had been, for all practical purposes, lost in January of 1968 at the Tet Offensive. And what kept it going was the military thinking was, well, the North Vietnamese lost. It was like a numbers game. It was like body counts, and that was not the way to look at this war. It was from their standpoint, it was like we're fighting two different wars. The North would have, seen the blood run out of 10 more generations before they gave up, and the American people were getting a little tired of the Vietnam War, so the writing more or less was on the wall. That was the saddest thing, I think, for me, to see that people were still dying, Vietnamese, Montagnard people in the middle, who had no stake.
Yeah.
And, the American also, a lot of people for no apparent reason, no good reason.
Yeah.
So,
How did your military experience change your life?
I think, as I say, growing up the way I did, and most of the people that were in my family or people that I knew, they had all been in World War II, and it was considered an okay thing. But I guess the first thing I learned, from the whole experience was, if you want to make the world a better place, killing a bunch of people is probably not a good place to start.
Yeah, you're right.
Or torturing people.
Yeah.
You're not going to make many friends that way.
No. Do you still keep in touch with anyone you met while you served?
No.
No. Okay. If your grandchild is considering going into the military, what advice would you give?
Just hold on to your humanity. You can go into a really inhumane situation and still. But if you lose that, what's the point? You're going to lose everything else with it.
Yeah.
I've met guys who, they're like shells. They're like. That's what makes us different than the animals, I think. There's whatever people have different names for it. Soul or spirit or just humanity. I would say hold on to that, guard it.
Yeah. If you were to go back in time to when you were serving, would you have done anything differently?
You mean if I had to go anywhere?
Yeah, if you had to go back to like anything you did, would you have done anything differently?
You know, the strange thing is that I don't really regret having been there. It was, you know, in a way, a learning experience like no other experience I've
Yeah.
seen. You know, I learned a lot about how governments work, and there was a journalist by the name of I.P. Stone, and his most famous quote was that governments lie, all governments lie. So it's not an American thing, you know.
Yeah.
You know, it's just, and I don't even know if it's because they're bad people. You know, I don't think the people, the architects of the Vietnam War were even necessarily bad people. And if they deceived the American people, I think it was sort of, they were doing it for, you know, they thought they were doing it for their own good. They were making decisions that were for the good of the country, but it turned out not to be, you know.
Yeah.
And it just, there was no end in sight, you know. It was like it went on and on. I don't know if you ever studied anything about the Vietnam War, but
I actually have. Last year I did, but we didn't cover much about it. They just give you like the
Yeah.
general idea. They don't go much into depth about like everything, like really. So, yeah. Are you connected to the veterans community on Cape Cod?
not really. No. When I was at Fort Bragg, when I was, you know, learning about this whole Middle East thing going on, I was actually active in the anti-war movement. I was a member
Wow.
of Vietnam Veterans Against the War. And it was odd because at the same time I had a really high security clearance. And it didn't seem to bother them that I was, you know, writing articles for the underground newspaper on base and things like that. It didn't seem to bother them. In fact, when I was getting out of the military, when they tried to get you to re-enlist, and I said no thanks. The CIA tried to recruit me, and the FBI tried to recruit me, and I can't. There's no way that they would not have known about these other, you know, anti-war activities. So I don't know
Yeah.
what they wanted with me, you know.
What was life like in the first month after coming home? Was it hard to adapt when you came back?
Yeah, it's hard to adapt because it's a different world. You know, it's very, you acclimate to this new world, you know, it's kind of strange environment, kind of a primitive kind of environment, and a lot of, you know, bad things happening every day, day after day. And now it's tough to make that adjustment. It's hard to describe. I think when I first got out, I thought about going back to school, and I did eventually go back to college, you know, finish college, but I think it took a little time to, you know,
Yeah.
catch my breath, you know, kind of reacclimate to, because it's a totally different world, you know,
Yeah.
different rules.
Going back to the anti-war things you discussed about, how did you first like find out about that, the anti-war like program you were a part of?
Through other soldiers, I guess, at Fort Bragg. John Kerry was very popular in that, Vietnam Veterans Against the War at that time. And I went to demonstrations in Washington, and while I was actually still in the military.
Wow.
And So it was just kind of word of mouth, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Anything else, Liz?
No, I think it's good. Are you?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Oh,
Thank
you're very
you
welcome.
This is
Yeah.
very interesting.
Very interesting to learn about your experience.
Mm-hmm.
I'm glad to do it.
Uh-huh.
Okay.